Next up is Councilmember Bagley. It seems to me that the renaming of Alexandria streets is woke. Instead of embracing our diverse and at times sad history, you are trying to erase it. We are a city of slave traders and Nobel Prize winners. We should speak proudly of all we embody. What do you think? Mm-hmm.
Wait, can I?
Yeah, sure. Sure. There you go.
Well, I'm sorry. No, I'm pausing because I'm pausing in funny, like to that point about being dismissive. I'm actually pausing myself because I don't want to come off as dismissive, but I am not proud of our city's slave trading history. And so if I'm flushed in the face, like I'm a person who sort of is terrible at poker, but that's why I hesitated just then. Understanding history, teaching history, and naming things after historical figures are two very different things. I will, as a Jewish person, okay, I don't often lead with that part of my identity, but it is one thing to teach of anti-Semitism, to talk about the Holocaust, to teach about the history of the Jewish people in our own country and around the world. It is another to name a venue, a street, a location after a person who who has perpetrated crimes against any other race, ethnicity, religion. I'm not sure if that's why the mayor handed me this question, but I feel this deeply, and so I appreciate everybody giving me a moment here. I feel this question deeply because I would not want to live on a street or be in a city that took the limited opportunities to name a street or a school or a hospital after someone who had perpetrated, evil, violent acts against, my community or any other community based on their identity. So my apologies for making this source.
No.
Obviously it's a complicated time in a way to be a Jewish person. I am, I thank my colleagues who at meetings have acknowledged world events and the loss of any life in the world right now, any life to violence and to war. But this is why things like this matter. There are 160,000 Alexandrians, right? Most of us are not going to have something named after us. That's just the reality. There are limited opportunities. So we should be careful and conscious and deliberate of how we use those limited opportunities. We are naming Julia John's Way over by the hospital, intentionally. Our street naming process is intentionally addressing what was an intentional act. I really do invite people to look at that 1953 ordinance. The streets that we are focusing on initially in this process were the result of an ordinance that explicitly said everything on a certain side of the city heading in a certain direction shall be named. I don't want to misstate. Shall be named, to honor a Confederate figure. That was proactive and intentional. That's what we are doing. We are proactively and intentionally, addressing that. I'll pause because this was a long-winded answer and overly emotional, but did I answer the question?
Yes, you did, Councilmember Bagley. Councilwoman Gaskins and Councilman Chapman.
Well, first, thank you for your words, Councilmember Bagley. I always believe in being honest, so I'm going to be honest. I have a real issue with the term woke. I think at the end of the day, to understand history, to recognize that there are injustices, to acknowledge discrimination and the issues and the challenges that we have in this country should not be a trend or a phase or a popular word. It's a fact, and it's something I think that we all should be seeking to educate ourselves on. The question or the statement talked about, can we proudly recognize others? And I have to be honest with you, in too many places I think we do that already. We already celebrate things that I would argue we shouldn't. And as a Black woman who is a descendant of slaves, I cannot proudly walk around and celebrate people who wanted to erase me, who thought I don't even say less than a person, probably was not a person. And I think that doesn't mean that we don't talk about it. We have museums, we have walks, we have all of these things where as a city we are saying, let's educate ourselves on it, let's talk about it, let's understand. But that doesn't mean we have to create monuments or signs to celebrate people who did heinous and horrible acts, who recognize that, or who wanted to recognize and believe that other people did not deserve to live and be valued in the Alexandria that we love and appreciate. And when I think about, I love how my colleague used the word intentional, because that is what this naming process is about. When you look through the history and the ordinance that was created, that was an intentional act by the council to say, we want to put on these signs. A sign, it is a testament. It is, you are taking somebody's name, or you're taking a figure or a flower or whatever the different things are that we use, and you are giving it a symbol. You are putting it up there to pass every single day. And while you, an individual, may not recognize or think about, oh, what's that named after, there are other people who do. We represent almost 160,000 people, and as many people who have written in and said, I think this is a waste of time, or I don't think this is something you should do, there are so many people on the other side who are saying, what took you so long? Why is this process so long? Why are we not naming 10 streets every year? And I think we have to be sensitive to that. We have to take our role and recognize that we cannot just walk around and say we want to be an inclusive or diverse or an inviting and welcoming city if we're not taking an intentional act to be able to represent and celebrate the people who embody that diversity. And I'll be honest with you, I don't know that I always felt this way, and the mayor probably remembers when we got our assignments, I said, please don't put me on the naming committee. It's not where my goals were, where I wanted to be. But I was put on it, and I'm so glad I have been, because in this, it has also been such a tremendous education for me. I would encourage anybody, if you have not had a chance to look at our Historical Alexandria Resources Commission, they were charged with helping put together a list of names of notable Alexandrians or folks who have had, with a particular focus on women and minorities who have had an impact on this community. And when you go through those names, when you see the stories of people that it is like, why have we not celebrated? Why are we not teaching about them every day? I think you will be so amazed and be thinking, maybe a street sign isn't even enough. We need to be finding other ways to honor these stories and legacies as well. And so I would encourage people, don't just stop on the page and look at the ordinance and the why we're doing this. Look at the other names. Look at what's being proposed. I think we've also had a lot of other people who have said, could you consider not doing a full renaming, but maybe a rededication? And they're sending in stories of their grandparents. They're sending in stories of other people who they may not have been the one to do something that maybe in history we would say is extremely remarkable, but they made an impact on their neighbor, and they did something that's much more of value and more important to the things we want to celebrate in the community than Confederate leaders. So I would just encourage folks, this is not some trend, it's not some phase, it's not something we're trying to do to be a part of national media. It is something we're doing because we care about people and we care about their experience in this community.
So as Councilwoman Gaskins noted, we do choose council committee assignments every 3 years, and we do it as consensus. I don't decree. But you will see this is now the third member of the naming committee I will recognize next, Councilman Chapman. It's Councilmember Bagley, Councilwoman Gaskins, Councilman Chapman, and I think you'll see why I chose all three. So, Councilman Chapman.
And I want to go off talking about trends. And a trend that you may not have studied, you may not have paid attention to, is the trend of the lost cause of the early 1900s. If you have not paid attention to that and read up on it, please do so. Please educate yourself. after Confederates came back, and let me start. I'm going to give a little bit of a history lesson. If you don't know about Alexandria's Civil War history, you need to educate yourself. And I'm not trying to do that to be dismissive or mansplain, but it opened the eyes for me when I really read through what happened here in our city as it related to the Civil War and men going off to war, leaving Alexandria to head off and fight for what they believed in. I'm not sitting here judging them per se for that act, but I do understand that we were not a battlefield. Individuals left our community to go fight for the South if they felt like it. Our city was inhabited for the better part, I don't want to say 95% of the Civil War, by the Union Army. We were basically a garrison for them during the war. After the war is over, both Union and Confederate leaders understand that they still have to live together in a united country. And so even though pretty much every member of the Confederate Army committed technical treason, they were still allowed to keep land after Reconstruction. They were allowed to still participate in the democracy of our United States. And they were allowed to go back to trying to live as they were living before the war. Their next generation, coming up through the late 1800s into the early 1900s, would start to focus on the stories that they heard in their childhood about what their parents and grandparents had done in the war, and trying to, you can say educate, you can say do more than that. I don't want to make it super nefarious, but it was very intentional to talk about and raise up to a level the Confederate belief system, the Confederate Army, the Confederate officers, and put them high on a pedestal in particularly the South. You might not think we are the Deep South, and most folks do not consider us the Deep South, but we are below the Mason-Dixon line. And so this type of work was done in our communities. There is no other rational explanation for the ordinance in 1952 than that of the lost cause. So many of those names are individuals that did not step foot in Alexandria. And so Alexandrians would not know who many of those individuals are because they were not at war. They were here with the Union Army. And so they're not hearing about all of the individuals named on our streets. They do not know even back then the names of all those individuals on those streets unless someone like a council brings that to them and says, this is what we're going to do, and we're going to put these individuals high up on this pedestal. I don't have an issue with the logistics of street naming. We're talking about some of the burden on those who might get their street named, the time that it might take you, the cost, and trying to work out those logistics. But please, we need to all educate ourselves around what happened in the years and decades and generations after the Civil War. Because we have not only street names, we have private schools that were formed because of this unwillingness to work together and be together as communities. And let's make it very clear, the Confederacy would not be happy with the community that we all, regardless of how we feel about this particular issue, we all have built. Because everyone in this room has probably worked or lived by somebody who is not like them, who did not come from the same background, whose family did not come from the same place. And this is not what they were trying to, this was not the ideals of their community at that time. I would have been working on as a piece of property. If you don't believe me, look at the Articles of Succession. I don't want to argue with people about that. Just go read what they wrote. The very details and basics of what we are trying to do, as you heard from my colleagues, is something that's very very deeply for me. As many of you know, I teach Black history every week. I would just want to teach it because so few folks know it. I'm not trying to brainwash people. I'm just trying to show that, yes, we do have slave traders here in our city, and this is who they were, this is what they did, this is how much money they made, and these might have been some of the people that passed through here. Because we are so busy in our lives, many times I find that we don't have the time to get into the depths of some of the issues that we need to. And honestly, what the Confederate and the Lost Cause has done is something that we each need to spend some time learning and educating ourselves. We now know when we talk about the perspective or the bias that Fox News might have or CNN might have, we don't talk about the bias and the perspective that the Lost Cause has had on our lives and this nation. Because that was definitely, if you read through the Lost Cause and understand it and put it in the context with media bias, you will be astounded by what you're reading and the bias that was brought to the forefront of a number of American communities, where individuals that they had no knowledge of, because of the work of a very small few, has elevated people that they do not know to places of prominence in their community. Like I would gladly sit down with anybody and talk through the details of that. I have no problem doing that. I don't want to be dismissive of anybody's perspective and how they've gotten to where they feel that the way they feel. But if you haven't read through the work of the Lost Cause in so many states, including Virginia, I think you are missing a huge piece of American history.
Councilman Aguirre, and then Councilmember Bagley. Councilman Bagley.
AlexandriaVA.gov/street renaming. And because despite the powerful emotional historical comments made here, there are practical implications to people living on these streets. We are aware of those, and there's an FAQ that will start to break down what happens to my driver's license, what happens to my mail, what happens to my deed, nothing, by the way. But recognizing it's not an entirely emotional issue, it is also a practical one. So /street renaming. Thank you.
So I don't want to belabor the point. My colleagues have made excellent statements to, try and enlighten folks and push back on some things and just provide general education. I'm glad that, the word woke was brought up, because I also take some, it's, if you were to ask 10 people what that word means, you would get 10 different answers. And not to be rude to the person that asked this question, but if you were to ask them, what does it mean to you? I'm sure they would have some difficulty in giving you a definition. It has become this very emotionally charged, ephemeral type of word that nobody really knows what it is, but it gives you some type of feeling, right? So that's to start off. Secondly, I don't think I can't remember the question or comment made something was talking about erasure, but it just, erasure is something that comes to mind whenever this topic comes up. And, I don't think there's anybody in this room that hasn't learned about the Civil War. I mean, I don't care where you are in the country, you learn about the Civil War. You don't learn about what Councilman Chapman teaches on his tours. You don't learn about the plight of the Mexican Americans in the Southwest. I mean, there might be like a little box on one page, right? So we're not talking about an erasure, because everybody's still learning about the Civil War. And, it's not a brainwashing to learn the full history. We're just adding pages into the history book that were intentionally kept out. And my colleague brought up the Holocaust. If you go to Germany, there aren't any street names after Nazi generals. There's not any statues. I mean, it's no secret that I'm from Los Angeles, and when I first came to the East Coast, I went to North Carolina, and I saw statues and schools and streets, and frankly, I was a little shocked. I mean, coming from the West Coast, like, when you name a school after someone, you're honoring them. When you name a street after someone, you're honoring them. When you put up a statue, you're honoring them. That was a piece of the culture shock that I experienced when I first got out to the East Coast and to the South. But I mean, these things are, as was said, they were done intentionally, and so this council has taken it upon itself to intentionally change course, to start to correct for past wrongs and past harms. And that's why I'm proud that from the moment I got onto council, one of my first budget amendments was how much would it cost to change the street names. And thanks to the mayor for accelerating this process. And as he mentioned, he used my budget memo to help guide some of this, so we know some of the cost. And as was acknowledged, we know that there is practical matters to this, and we will deal with that as a city. But the bigger issue is really what we're going after.
Okay, Councilman McPike, then Councilman Chapman.
Yeah. I want to thank my colleagues who are on the renaming committee. I hope that folks who are here in the room or watching this later on videos see the thought and care that we are putting into this, a level of thought and care that the 1953 City Council did not take when they changed all of these streets, many of which already had names, renamed them after Confederates, many of whom never set foot in Alexandria. Some of the names are so disconnected from Alexandria, they are misspelled. They were misspelled, and it wasn't done to honor these people. It was done to send a message of hate, a message of exclusion to African Americans and to those who supported what at the time was a burgeoning civil rights movement. It was a message, and I think we and my colleagues on the renaming committee and we as a council and we as a city are sending a message now that these people who were never part of Alexandria's past should not pretend to be a part of Alexandria's future. These are not the values of our city, and we are going to do everything we can to minimize the disruption caused by this process, but we are going to remove the stain of this bad decision and this bad message from the maps of the city of Alexandria.
Okay. Councilman Chapman.
And I want to wrap it up, and I think my colleagues have done it, very eloquently, but I want to do it very basically. The Lost Cause was a hustle. Just frankly, just straight out, it was a hustle. It was a historical hustle. And what we are saying, and the message we are trying to send is, we are no longer, as a city, as residents, as a community, wanting to be hustled. We want folks that represent our values, that have had an impact on Alexandria itself, that know our community, have stepped foot in our city. That's what we're looking to do. That's what we're looking to talk about. And the hustle needs to be over. It needs to be over for the whole country, but that's a larger, bigger conversation. But we can do our part in talking about this openly, like we have, and just saying that this hustle needs to end.